Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, and I'll be your host for today's show. We're going to be talking about trends in cybersecurity board practices. And joining me for this session is Barbara Berlin, who's the Managing Director of PwC's Governance Insight Center. Welcome back, Barbara.
Hi, TK. It's great to be here with you today.
This is a two-part series on cybersecurity, cyber risk. And in the first session, we talked about the trends and the threats of that happen in the sort of cyber landscape. So today we want to take an inward look and look at those practices or trends that boards are using to either mitigate or control cyber events. And the first thing that I'm going to ask you to do, if you would be to sort of review the mindset that a company has with respect to dealing with cyber and also responding once they've been breached.
Well, great, TK. I'm really glad we're talking about cyber risk because, as you know, CEOs are very concerned about this risk. We saw that from our CEO survey. And certainly if you look at the board survey information that we've seen and you've seen, it is a top risk for many companies. So I'm glad we're talking about it. I guess as I think about your question on mindset, first, I think as we talk about cybersecurity, while the IT department does a lot of the heavy lifting, it's the responsibility of everybody in the organization. So when we talk about mindset, I think cybersecurity needs to be built into the culture of the organization. So what I mean by that is, there needs to be periodic communications, training, awareness of what the latest threats are. So I think that's a really important piece of it. To that, as I think about the IT department, the heavy lifting that they do, they're the ones that's obviously implementing policies, they're monitoring their networks, they're implementing solutions to address risk. They really need to be focused on what are the key risks to the organization. And I think, that starts with understanding what are those mission critical systems and inventorying what those are, as well as those assets that they need to protect. And then really thinking about who are our threat actors, what are their motives, and so really defining then what are the key risks to the organization, and then putting investments and resources against those key risks. And so that's something that clearly, the CISOs are focused on. And boards need to get that information to effectively perform their oversight role. So good, robust information that really helps them understand what those key risks are. And I guess as I've been speaking to many boards and companies about this topic, I certainly see maturity happening here when we talk about cybersecurity. Certainly company practices, board practices are continuing to mature. I think the difficult aspect of cybersecurity is one is a little bit of a cat and mouse game, right? The risks keep changing. I think as we looked at moving to a remote workforce, as we look at the enhanced digital efforts that companies are doing, and we look at the sophistication of threat actors, all of those areas continue to change the threat landscape. And so it's something that companies and boards need to stay focused on and spend enough time and efforts in these areas to address the most important risks.
Well, Barbara, what we do know is that oversight of risk management and the processes that management uses is one of the key duties that the board has. And from my experience, cyber is one area where people don't feel terribly confident on knowing that they have their arms around this. As you said, constantly changing, whether they're state-sponsored programs or just hackers, it's a huge challenge that most board members aren't used to, sort of not feeling confident about. So it's a really important area. So let's dive in a little bit on what are some of the practices that you're seeing that might be helpful for boards to think about implementing at their own shop?
Yeah, thanks, TK. I probably over the last just few months have spoken to over 50 board members about what's working, what's not working when they're addressing cyber risk, what's on their minds. And as you said, this is a challenging area for the board. Most board members are not cyber experts. So getting access to the expertise they need, as well as getting good information to help them perform their oversight role is pretty critical. As I think about your question about some of the practices and some of the things that came out of my conversations with board members, maybe I'll start with one that I think is important, is really looking and knowing if there's a cyber risk lens on the strategic objectives of the organization. And so what I mean by that is, as companies are developing new products, new services, making acquisitions, entering new markets, there's a cyber risk component to all of those different items that should be considered and addressed. And that might not be the IT department. So I think it's something for the board to think about and have conversations with the right individuals about how those areas are getting a cyber risk lens. The second thing that probably came up most commonly in my conversations is some boards actually getting a cyber risk scorecard or dashboard, and many boards who don't that want one. And so when I say a cyber risk scorecard or dashboard, what I'm talking about is sort of getting sort of a standard template each time they meet with the CISO that really helps the board understand what are the key risks to the organization, how they're changing. And many times these scorecards are set up against a framework like the NIST framework. And then there are metrics that are being used, top 10, 15 metrics, to really help the board understand whether there's being progress made in a certain area or not. And so it really helps the board be able to sort of track improvements on risks. And again, whether we're making progress, whether we're putting resources in the right place. And so, as I said, many boards that I spoke with that aren't getting it, that's something that they're looking forward, would like to get. So I think there has to be this communication between the board and the CISO of the type of information they need. I think it's also important for the board. There's a lot of different areas as we talk about cyber risk. I'm hearing some boards getting information about, major events that happen in the market and how those impact the company. What are some of the learnings from those? What are the significant incidents that happened since they last met with the CISO? It might be getting information on cyber insurance policies and how those policies might be changing. So I think those are all key pieces of information. That's only, kind of scratching the surface here in our short time together. I did want to bring up a couple other trends. So one I'm seeing is boards starting to meet more frequently with the CISO in a private session. So I kind of assimilate that to the audit committee meeting with the chief audit executive, meeting with the external audit partner. And this is an opportunity for the board to build a relationship with the CISO, as well as to get their views outside the purview of management so that they can understand in these private meetings things like whether they're getting the support of management, what other risks they're most concerned about, whether they have adequate resources. And again, it's having that conversation with the CISO. So I'm seeing more boards starting to do that. And probably the last one that I'll mention, TK, is the use of third parties. We've seen a continued use of third parties at companies and this is really at the management level in terms of getting third parties in to do penetration testing, to do a cyber risk assessment on the company's program, on the maturity of the company's program, might be doing red team testing. But the point is there's other individuals that are coming in that are, outside of management that are taking a look at different areas of the company's cyber program. And what's different about that now is I am seeing at times that those individuals are reporting directly to the board And so that gives the board the opportunity to hear directly from those third parties findings, learn more about what they achieved, ask their questions, get answers directly from these individuals versus through management. And I think, boards are getting additional comfort through those third parties in terms of what they learn through looking at the company's cyber program. So I think boards are looking for different ways to understand the company's cyber program quality, as well as how it's working, and building those relationships with the CISO. So maybe I'll stop there. There's a lot we could cover, certainly longer than this few minutes together, TK.
Yeah, I'll just make one other comment to that. This mindset sort of and culture goes all the way back to sort of board composition. If you're a board that doesn't have anybody with any cyber experience or knowledge, third parties become very important. But additionally, when you're looking for that next director, with all that's happening in digital transformation and cyber these days, you may want to give consideration to somebody joining the board that at least has a surface level of understanding on both those areas that are going to play such a big role going forward.
Yeah, an important skill set, either the board having it or having access to it.
Yep. So, Barbara, we have about a minute left. What final advice would you offer the board of directors that are sort of efforting at this point to get their arms around cyber risk? What would be your final piece of advice?
Oh, goodness. Well, I think resiliency is really important. I didn't mention that yet, but I think that's where you started the question on if there is a successful breach. I think it's focusing on the preparedness of the company to address a breach. So I think, tabletop exercises, making certain who your, experts are that you want to reach out to, looking at different scenarios that can happen to the company. And what I'm seeing boards getting now, as I talk to some different companies and boards, is the communication framework to the board about how the board will be notified, how the board will continue to be informed as an event unfolds. So I think that's a key area. And maybe if you'll give me 30 seconds, the last one is if I think about all of these different points and the many conversations that happen about cybersecurity, just making certain you have the time and the skills to address this area. It's a big topic, and having 15 minutes on an agenda might not be enough time. So I think thinking through the oversight responsibility and where that sits.
Well, Barbara, we both can agree that this is a very critical and important topic to both the company and then subsequently to the board of directors. So I'm glad we've had a chance. It's sort of, again, been pushed aside a little bit with all the activity that's happened, with all the social events and the ESG, but it's rearing its ugly head again. And it's important. It, like you said, in the research, it's ending up at the top of what's keeping directors up at night. So I want to thank you for taking the time to sort of add this valuable information. So I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having me, TK.
And that will conclude this edition of Diligence Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.